The cabin lights glowed a muted gold as Flight 714 leveled off, the steady hum of engines settling into the background of whispered conversations and clinking ice. Marcus Halley stood in the aisle near row 18, shoulders squared, jaw tight, his carry-on wedged between his feet. He had boarded early, stowed his bag carefully, and taken the aisle seat printed on his boarding pass. Now a flight attendant hovered beside him, her smile thin and brittle, while two suited men and a uniformed supervisor watched like referees waiting for a whistle. It started with a request that wasn't a request at all. The attendant had leaned in and told Marcus there had been a mistake, that he needed to move back, that his seat was required for someone else. Marcus had smiled, assuming it was a mix-up, and handed over his phone with the boarding pass glowing. The attendant hadn't looked for long. She had sighed, rolled her eyes, and said the word upgrade like it was a favor, not a correction. When Marcus asked why the correction fell on him, the temperature shifted. Passengers nearby pretended not to listen while listening to everything. A woman across the aisle tightened her scarf. A teenager slipped out one earbud. The suited men, traveling together, glanced at Marcus and then at each other, smirking as if this was entertainment. The supervisor arrived, tall and broad, his tie immaculate, his voice practiced. He asked Marcus to comply, to avoid a scene, to be reasonable. Marcus asked again, calmly, for an explanation. The explanation came wrapped in insult. The attendant's voice sharpened, words tumbling faster, accusing him of holding up boarding, of being difficult, of not understanding airline policy. She leaned close enough that Marcus could smell the citrus of her perfume and hear the impatience beneath the politeness. When he didn't move, she said it, not loudly, but clearly enough. She said some people always think the rules don't apply to them. She said she'd call security if he didn't stop causing trouble. Marcus felt heat rise behind his eyes, a familiar burn he'd learned to control. He thought of his father teaching him to breathe through moments like this, to stand firm without shouting. He straightened, folded his boarding pass back into his pocket, and asked for her name. That request seemed to offend her more than his refusal. The supervisor's expression hardened. He gestured to the aisle, blocking Marcus's path, and told him the captain had been informed. What the captain knew was what the supervisor told him. What the cabin saw was a black man being told to move because someone else wanted his seat. When the supervisor threatened removal, a murmur rippled through the rows. A woman with silver hair stood and said she'd witnessed everything. A young man lifted his phone. The suited men laughed quietly, one whispering something about entitlement. The attendant's cheeks flushed red, and she snapped that filming was prohibited. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult anyone. He asked, again, for policy, for clarity, for fairness. The supervisor repeated himself, louder now, using words like non-compliant and disruptive. The labels slid onto Marcus like heavy coats he hadn't chosen. He felt the weight of eyes, the calculus people made when deciding whose side they were on, and how quickly neutrality could become judgment. Security never came. Instead, the captain did. He emerged from the cockpit, older, tired, scanning faces. He listened as the supervisor summarized, the attendant adding commentary. The silver-haired woman spoke again, steady and precise, recounting the sequence. Others nodded. The captain asked Marcus to show his boarding pass. Marcus did. The captain compared it with his tablet, frowned, and asked the attendant to step aside. There was a pause, long enough to hear the engines breathe. The captain cleared his throat and apologized to Marcus. He explained there had been an internal change, that a seat reassignment had been attempted improperly. He said Marcus was in the correct seat. The apology was professional, but something in his eyes suggested embarrassment. The attendant stared at the floor. The supervisor shifted his weight, suddenly less imposing. The captain didn't stop there. He addressed the cabin, thanking passengers for patience, reminding everyone of respect. Then he turned back to the supervisor and the attendant and asked them to follow him forward. The suited men looked surprised. The attendant protested, her voice small now, but the captain raised a hand. He said they would discuss conduct after landing. He said standards mattered. When the captain left, a quiet applause started, hesitant, then stronger. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging it without basking. He sat, heart still pounding, hands steady in his lap. The woman across the aisle smiled at him. The silver-haired woman squeezed his shoulder as she passed. The suited men stared ahead, expressions sour. Minutes later, another attendant arrived, with a drink Marcus hadn't ordered and a note. The note apologized again and offered miles. Marcus folded it, unmoved by the gesture but appreciative of the acknowledgement. He sipped the water, feeling the adrenaline ebb, replaced by a tired resolve. He thought about how easily the outcome could have been different, how often it was. As the flight continued, whispers turned into conversations about fairness, about how rules were applied. The young man who had filmed showed Marcus the video, promising to send it if needed. Marcus thanked him but said he hoped it wouldn't be. He hoped the discussion in the cockpit would be enough. When they landed, the captain stood at the door. He thanked Marcus personally and assured him the incident would be reviewed. The supervisor and the attendant were not there. Marcus stepped into the jet bridge, the cool air washing over him, carrying both relief and a familiar ache. He walked toward the terminal knowing he had done nothing wrong, knowing that sometimes standing still was its own kind of movement. In the terminal, Marcus paused by a window overlooking the tarmac, watching ground crews choreograph their work with practiced ease. The incident replayed in his mind, each inflection, each glance, catalogued without his consent. He wondered how many times the attendant had spoken that way and how many times it had gone unchallenged. He wondered how many passengers had swallowed the insult because missing a connection cost more than dignity. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues waiting at the conference he was flying to attend. He typed a brief reply, keeping it light, unwilling to let the moment define the day. As he walked, he noticed the familiar stiffness in his shoulders, the after-effect of vigilance. He stretched, breathed, and reminded himself that being right did not always feel victorious. At baggage claim, the silver-haired woman appeared again, introducing herself as Ellen. She told Marcus she had taught history for 30 years and recognized patterns when she saw them. She said she was proud of him for staying calm and for insisting on truth. Marcus thanked her and admitted that calm was learned, not innate. Ellen nodded, understanding etched into her smile. Outside, a driver held a sign with Marcus's name. During the ride, the city slid past in bands of glass and concrete. Marcus thought about the supervisor's words, how quickly authority borrowed language to shield itself. He thought about the captain, too, about leadership that listened rather than doubled down. The contrast lingered. That evening, Marcus attended the conference reception. Conversation swirled about markets and forecasts, but when someone asked about his flight, he told the story plainly, without embellishment. The room quieted. A few people shared their own stories, each one a thread in a larger tapestry. The act of telling transformed the experience from an isolated sting into a shared reckoning. Later, in his hotel room, Marcus watched the city lights flicker. He considered the video on the young man's phone and the miles offered as apology. He considered the difference between restitution and repair. He drafted an email to the airline, not angry, but precise, outlining what had happened and what accountability could look like. He pressed send and closed his laptop. Weeks passed. A letter arrived acknowledging the complaint, outlining training updates, and informing Marcus that disciplinary action had been taken. The language was careful, but the message was clear. Marcus read it twice, then set it aside. He knew change moved slowly, but it moved. On a return flight months later, Marcus boarded another plane, another aisle seat. The attendant greeted him warmly, eyes meeting his without calculation. The exchange was ordinary, which felt extraordinary. As he buckled in, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Not because the world had fixed itself, but because moments of insistence could ripple outward in ways unseen. When the plane lifted, Marcus looked out at the shrinking city and felt a quiet certainty. Dignity, he realized, was not granted by seats or uniforms. It was claimed in moments like the one he had faced, claimed by standing still and speaking clearly. The engines roared, carrying him forward, and he settled into the journey, ready for whatever came next. As clouds gathered beneath the wings, Marcus reflected on the many faces from that day, replaying them like a quiet roll call. He remembered the teenager with the earbud, later sending a message of thanks through social media after recognizing him from the conference badge. He remembered the suited men's laughter fading into silence when the captain spoke. He remembered how power often revealed itself not in volume, but in who was asked to move. The story traveled farther than Marcus expected. A panel invited him to speak about equity in everyday systems, and he accepted with hesitation. On stage, under warm lights, he described the flight not as a spectacle but as a case study. He spoke about policy and discretion, about how discretion could tilt toward bias without guardrails. The audience listened, some nodding, some wincing, all engaged. Afterward, a flight attendant approached him, eyes earnest. She thanked him for sharing and admitted the job could harden people in subtle ways. She said the training mattered, that hearing the human impact mattered more. Marcus thanked her in return, recognizing the courage it took to say so. At home, Marcus's father called. They spoke about breathing through moments, about standing firm without shouting. His father laughed softly and said the lesson had finally paid dividends. Marcus laughed too, the sound easing something he hadn't realized was tight. Time smoothed the edges of the memory, but it never erased it. That was fine. Some moments were meant to stay sharp, to remind you why you chose patience over retreat. As Marcus planned his next trip, he selected his seat with care, not out of fear, but out of intention. He believed systems could improve when people insisted they do. On another flight, years later, a disturbance broke out. 2 rows ahead, voices rose, a misunderstanding spiraled. Before it could calcify, an attendant intervened with clarity and respect, explaining options, listening, resolving. Marcus watched, heart steady, and felt a quiet gratitude. Progress, he thought, often arrived quietly, without applause. The plane landed smoothly. Passengers disembarked in orderly lines. Marcus stepped into the terminal with the unremarkable relief of arrival. He carried his bag, his work, his memories. And as he walked, he knew that the insistence he had practiced that day remained available. A skill honed and ready, whenever dignity required defense. He paused at a cafe, ordered coffee, and watched travelers pass, each carrying private stories. Marcus took a sip, savoring the warmth, and felt grounded. The world moved, imperfect and persistent. He moved with it, attentive, prepared, believing that ordinary courage, practiced often enough, could change the tone of a room, a cabin, a journey, one clear moment at a time. He finished his coffee, shouldered his bag, and walked on, steady, aware, resolved, ready for tomorrow with calm confidence.